People keep talking about how great Linux is, but let's be honest, there's some real problems. And not only that, with all the constant arguing, it feels more like a political platform than an operating system. I want a future where Linux just works, a future where updates don't break your sound card and make it disappear like a witness from a mob movie, a future where your GPU doesn't have to declare a political party just for your window manager to talk to it. And why do I need 4 compatibility layers and a sacrifice just to be able to play a game? And don't even get me started on package managers. We have a bunch of them: apt, DNF, zypper, and so on. It's like every distribution needs their own special way of installing Firefox. But you know what? We need change. We need a future where distro politics don't prevent our hardware from working, where we can actually ask questions in forums without being told to read the manual, even though we did read the manual, but it was written for an astrophysicist. We need to make Linux great. Joking aside, Linux is actually awesome. There's all kinds of things to get excited about, but there's also some rough edges as well. And as someone that's been using Linux for decades, I want to see it succeed. And that's actually why I created this channel. I wanted to do my part to give back to the community and create content that adds value to Linux users. But along the way, I've also encountered some problems with Linux as well, and, well, I want to see something happen to make it better. Hello again everyone, and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In today's video, what I'm going to do is talk about 5 things that I hate about Linux. And this might surprise some of you, especially those of you that have been following me for a long time. The thing is, I love Linux. It's my favorite platform. However, that doesn't imply that it's perfect. In fact, everything has room for improvement, and Linux is no exception. So what I'm going to do is talk about 5 things that I think Linux really does need to improve. And deciding on just 5 things is a bit hard because Linux is a massive platform. There's all kinds of different things to pay attention to. We have desktop environments, Linux distributions, commands. There's all kinds of things within the Linux community. As someone that's been using Linux for over 20 years, I've noticed a few things that I think Linux can do better, so I'm going to highlight those things in this video. Also, before we dive in, I wanted to mention that you should really consider becoming a channel member of Learn Linux TV. Not only will you be supporting the channel by doing so, you'll also get access to ad-free content, as well as early access to select videos. There's other benefits coming soon, but if you want to support the channel, it's a great way to do so. So consider becoming a channel member. I would really appreciate it. Anyway, with all that said, it's time to get started. So let's get into my list of 5 things that I hate about Linux right now. And let's start with package management because, honestly, it's a mess. If you're new to Linux, package management refers to the standard way that software is installed. Most distributions use software repositories to deliver applications, and you install those apps with a package manager. From the terminal, this is as simple as running a command such as apt install, but you don't have to use the terminal. Many popular distros include GUI app stores that pull from the same repositories. Fedora and similar distributions have GNOME software, Ubuntu has the Ubuntu App Center, and Linux Mint includes Software Manager. These tools generally make installing software pretty straightforward for most people. But even with that, package management across Linux is wildly inconsistent, and that inconsistency comes with real downsides. Take LibreOffice for example. When a new version comes out, Windows and macOS users can download and install it immediately. They simply download the installer and run it. On Linux, many distributions only provide older versions of applications in their repositories, and that means you might not get the latest LibreOffice release for months or even years. Distributions such as Debian stick firmly to this approach. They freeze application versions until the next major OS release. As a result of that, you can end up stuck with outdated software even when newer versions are widely available. And this doesn't just affect convenience, it affects compatibility as well. Using LibreOffice again as an example, an older version may struggle with opening or saving certain Microsoft Office documents, not because LibreOffice itself is inferior, but because your distribution's older build lacks the latest compatibility fixes. This leads some users to believe that LibreOffice is the problem, when the real issue is still packaging. Now, not all distributions work this way. Rolling release distros keep everything up to date continuously. And Arch Linux is a perfect example. You simply update your system and you get the latest versions of everything. But rolling distros are less common than fixed release ones, and fixed releases often leave users stuck in outdated applications. Supporters of the fixed release model argue that avoiding the latest software increases stability, but that simply isn't true. Newer and older versions of software both contain bugs, and locking users to old versions actually introduces its own problems. Now, there are ways around this. Tools like FlatHub let you install the latest app versions directly, bypassing the distribution's repository entirely. This works well, but for new Linux users, it can be confusing. They're suddenly forced to ask, should I install the version from my distro or the version from FlatHub? That kind of fragmentation can be overwhelming. In my opinion, Linux repositories are excellent for system-level components and updates, the OS, drivers, libraries, core utilities, and so on. But user applications should not be tied to those same repositories. In the end, the state of package management on Linux is chaotic, and I definitely think it needs to improve. Next, let's talk about hardware compatibility on Linux because it's a mixed experience. Now, the reality is that Linux actually has excellent hardware support, often better out of the box than Windows. Most common hardware just works on Linux without needing to manually hunt down drivers. In contrast, Windows frequently requires users to install drivers for networking, GPUs, and other peripherals before everything functions correctly. For example, consider this screenshot of the device manager in Windows after a fresh install. There's a number of question marks here, and each one represents drivers that will need to be installed manually if Windows Update doesn't end up finding them first. But even though hardware support is generally better on Linux, there are exceptions, and those exceptions are what give people the impression that Linux has poor hardware support overall. The most common trouble spots are GPUs and Wi-Fi adapters. NVIDIA cards, for example, require a proprietary driver to reach full performance. Some Wi-Fi chip manufacturers don't release drivers for Linux at all, or only offer poorly maintained ones, forcing users to install them manually. And since GPUs and Wi-Fi adapters are critical components of your system, problems with these create especially frustrating situations. Still, the majority of hardware on the market today does work perfectly out of the box under Linux. But you might be wondering, why do I say Linux has great hardware support and I also call it inconsistent? Well, the inconsistency comes primarily from the distributions themselves. Each distro handles drivers differently, and some ship with much older driver stacks than others. Debian, for example, is one of my favorite distributions, but its philosophical and technical choices lead to extremely outdated drivers. That means if you buy a brand new laptop today and attempt to install Debian, there's a real chance that something won't work simply because the drivers that are included are too old. Meanwhile, Ubuntu does an excellent job with newer hardware. It includes more recent drivers, and it also ships hardware enablement updates that add support for newer devices over time. Fedora releases new versions twice a year, so it generally tends to stay reasonably up to date as well. However, because each distribution updates drivers at different speeds, your experience with Linux hardware compatibility can change dramatically depending on which distro you choose. And that means that two people with the exact same laptop can have completely different experiences simply because they install different distros. But there's also another complication as well. Some distros restrict access to proprietary drivers. And the problem with proprietary drivers is that they don't provide source code, so distro maintainers can't fix bugs or patch them. NVIDIA is probably one of the most egregious examples of this. The open source driver for NVIDIA GPUs that ships with Linux performs significantly worse for gaming, so most users will need to install the proprietary driver. Ubuntu makes this easier by featuring an additional drivers app, and you could use that app to easily install the NVIDIA driver. On the other hand, other distros make this process unnecessarily difficult or even refuse to include proprietary drivers at all. Now, don't get me wrong, I totally understand that proprietary drivers are far from ideal. They're closed, hard to fix, and often less stable. But sometimes these are the only way to get full performance from your hardware. After all, if you paid hundreds or even thousands of dollars for a GPU, you deserve to get full use of it. Distributions that restrict access to these drivers create a worse experience for their users, not because the Linux community prefers open source, which I agree with, but because these restrictions punish end users instead of the vendors that are actually responsible for this problem. This kind of gatekeeping can single-handedly turn newcomers away from Linux. Sorry to interrupt my own video, but I wanted to let you guys know that there's some new products available in the Learn Linux TV merch shop that you should definitely check out. And there's something for everyone. For example, the Dark Side of the Terminal shirt for sysadmin rockstars, a classic red tee with a Debian swirl for distro loyalists, And of course, the infamous "by the way I use art" shirt for maximum effect at meetups. There's also the classic apt install coffee shirt for those of you that have caffeine-fueled working sessions. And there's some other cool things like drinkware, stickers, buttons, and a lot more. In fact, if you're obsessed with Linux, there's a shirt for that too. Every purchase helps support the channel and lets you rock some seriously geeky fashion at the same time. Just visit the URL that you see on the screen, get yourself something nice, and support Linux learning. I would really appreciate it. Thanks again, everyone, and with that out of the way, let's get back to our video. Now, the best personal solution is to buy hardware that explicitly supports Linux. That's what I do. I research everything before I buy it. But many people come to Linux after purchasing their hardware, and they shouldn't be penalized for that. Whenever a distribution ships outdated drivers or blocks proprietary ones, it's essentially punishing users for choices made by hardware vendors. And that's not only unfair, it's also not helpful at all. Proprietary drivers may be unpleasant, but if a vendor refuses to open source them, it makes no sense to punish the people that are just trying to use their hardware. Each and every distribution that tries to block proprietary drivers is doing a major disservice to their users, and they should stop doing that immediately. Proprietary drivers are definitely something that every distro needs to support. Next, let's talk about HiDPI displays, screens with very high resolutions. When it comes to Linux, support for these displays is inconsistent across distributions, and sometimes it's outright bad. Whenever HiDPI isn't handled properly, text becomes tiny and difficult to read, and entire applications can appear so small that you'll have to squint to make out anything on your screen. Now, to be fair, most distributions do offer scaling options that can fix this. You could generally increase the scaling to 150% or higher, which makes everything larger while still keeping the display at its optimum resolution. And since every modern distro includes some form of scaling, this issue is relatively easy to correct. But what I find strange about this is that some distributions still default to no scaling at all on HiDPI screens, making the interface nearly unreadable right from the start. Even worse, some installers themselves aren't scaled properly, so you're forced to navigate tiny text before you can even reach the settings menu in the first place. Some distros do get this right and automatically scale appropriately, while others expect the user to adjust everything manually. And because I record footage from various distributions for the videos I do on this channel, I encounter this issue constantly. Before I even start recording, I often have to adjust the scaling settings, and sometimes the text is so small that I have to lean in until my face is only inches away from the screen just to read the options. And scaling is such a simple fix that it's baffling to me why some distributions don't automatically apply it during installation. If the first thing a user sees is unreadable text, that leaves a terrible first impression. I mean, why not just default to 150% scaling on HiDPI displays? If someone does prefer smaller text, they could simply turn down the scaling with a single setting. There's just no downside. Another frustrating aspect of HiDPI is that some applications don't respect the system scaling settings at all. And this results in a situation where even after you configure scaling in your distro, certain apps may still have tiny text. Now, to be fair, this issue isn't Linux's fault, it's on the software vendors. And this problem isn't unique to Linux either. Windows and macOS have the same issues with non-compliant apps. So while I can't blame Linux for third-party applications that don't scale correctly, I can question why some distributions still choose to default to no scaling at all. Fortunately, once you do find the scaling setting, it's very easy to adjust. But the fact that some distros don't provide readable, properly scaled text out of the box just makes no sense at all. Continuing, another issue with Linux is that some popular applications simply aren't available, which can make Linux users feel like they're being left out. In other cases, the applications are available, but they're harder to install or behave differently than they do on other platforms. Now, to be fair, plenty of well-known apps do work great on Linux. For example, Slack, Visual Studio Code, Steam, Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, and many other cross-platform tools are available and work great. The thing is, app availability on Linux is better now than it's ever been before, but it's still far from ideal. And a major example of this is Adobe's suite of applications, which aren't available on Linux at all. That doesn't affect me personally though, because I don't rely on Adobe products, and I never have, but users who do may have to learn entirely new workflows using alternative tools. Gaming is another area with gaps. While the situation has improved dramatically, especially with the popularity of the Steam Deck pushing more developers to consider Linux, Many AAA titles don't support Linux or worse, block it altogether due to thinking Linux users are cheating just because they use an alternative platform, which is just plain silly. And the GOG Galaxy app isn't available either, and several productivity tools are missing as well. On my side, this doesn't really impact me too much because I follow a Linux-first approach. For content creation, I use tools that are designed to run on Linux, such as DaVinci Resolve for editing, Audacity for audio, GIMP for graphics, and so on. But even then, I still hit obstacles that users on Windows or macOS simply don't experience. DaVinci Resolve, for example, has inconsistent Linux support. On Windows and macOS, it usually installs and runs without too much trouble, as long as your hardware is compatible. On Linux, though, installation can be finicky and codec support is incomplete. This forces some video editors to rely on uncompressed formats that waste a ton of storage space. Another example of this is a lack of native Microsoft Office applications. Yes, you can use the web versions, but in my experience they don't perform as well as the desktop apps on Windows. And this pushes users toward LibreOffice, which is completely capable, but the interface is different enough that new users will have to relearn where things are. And to make matters worse, just like I mentioned with my first point, some distributions ship outdated versions of LibreOffice, which can cause real compatibility problems while opening Microsoft Office documents. These issues aren't LibreOffice's fault, but users often assume they are. For the record, every book I've had professionally published was written in LibreOffice, so I know it's a solid tool, but outdated builds can give people the wrong impression. I do think this situation will continue to improve as more vendors recognize the value of supporting Linux, but right now, people switching to Linux may run into missing applications, inconsistent support, or the need to adjust their workflows until the ecosystem matures further. Finally, I want to talk about an issue that causes more frustration for new Linux users than anything else: toxicity within the Linux community itself. And unfortunately, this problem shows up in several ways. One major example of this is elitism. I often see new users post on Reddit or in community forums about how proud they are to have installed Linux, and then they share which distribution they decided to go along with. But instead of being welcomed, someone instead replies to tell them that they made the wrong choice. Maybe they'll say something like, "Ubuntu is terrible, you should have installed Fedora," or something along those lines. And this kind of behavior is absolutely ridiculous. The entire reason we have so many distributions is to give people options. Yet, some people act as if their preferences are the only valid ones. Another problem within the Linux community is the habit of dismissing questions with comments like, "Read the manual." The whole point of forums is to discuss and help each other, so getting annoyed when someone asks a question completely defeats the purpose. In reality, many people do read the documentation, but it's not always well written or easy to understand. In fact, that's one of the reasons why this channel exists. And even when someone hasn't read the manual yet, discussing things openly is still valuable. And responding with RTFM helps absolutely no one. If someone is so bothered by beginner questions that they can't respond politely or constructively, it would be better for them to simply say nothing. Such a useless reply adds no value to the conversation, and it only pushes people away. Another form of toxicity comes from hostility towards new technologies. Flatpak, Snap, systemd, Wayland, all of these receive backlash simply because they're different from other tools. This constant negativity is not only discouraging new users, it also discourages developers as well. Imagine spending hours writing a patch for systemd, only to have someone dismiss the project by saying systemd sucks. With that kind of environment, it's a miracle anyone contributes code at all. And to me, this is the Linux community absolutely shooting itself in the foot. Constant complaining, gatekeeping, and elitism make things harder for newcomers and could burn out developers. And honestly, why would anyone want to switch to Linux if so many people spend their time arguing about which technology is superior? Going forward, I think communities should adopt stricter moderation and have better guidelines to reduce toxicity. I mean, encouraging constructive conversations about the pros and cons of things, rather than simply saying, "this software sucks," would make a huge difference. It's important for everyone to understand that not everyone uses software the same way, and not everyone values the same things. If we communicate more respectfully and focus on helping people rather than criticizing them, the Linux ecosystem will absolutely grow. And there you go. In today's video, I went over 5 ways in which I think Linux can improve. The thing is, Linux is my favorite platform. I absolutely love it, and because I love it, I want to see it improve and grow and become better. And in this video, we've explored some of the ways in which I think Linux can do exactly that. If you liked today's video, then be sure to click the like button to let YouTube know, and also subscribe to Learn Linux TV if you haven't already done so. I upload new Linux-related content each and every week. Anyway, thanks again for watching today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.